Ready.
Hello everyone, എല്ലാവർക്കും നമസ്കാരം. I consider it a great honor and privilege to be part of Fipresci and also to be invited to deliver this year's Chidananda Dasgupta Memorial Lecture, who was one of the most visionary amongst film thinkers in India. And his writings were a great source of inspiration and guidance to my generation, a model to think cinema as a critical insider, someone who is rooted in one's own tradition, culture, and more importantly, history, and is at the same time deeply concerned with the global contemporary. This year also marks the birth centenary year of Ritwik Ghatak, and so I thought it would be an ideal occasion to bring both of them together or to think through the works of both to share some observations on Ghatak films and about what made him a very unique filmmaker. I think it is important to go back to his works, not only to understand a certain period in Indian political and film history, but also to trace the lineages of the present, the promises and betrayals that led to where we are today, and also figure out the warning signals and possible forms and sources of resistance that Ghatak proposed. I would like to ponder upon how he differs from his illustrious contemporaries, Satyajit Ray and Manal Sen. Let me begin with the motif of betrayal and separation in Ghatak films. Let us go to the opening sequence of Subarnarekha, where we witness the inauguration of a school in a refugee colony. What we see first is the character Haraprasad, the idealist, hoisting the national flag and chanting Vande Mataram. It is the inauguration of a school in the refugee colony for refugee children who have been uprooted by partition and have taken refuge in the new colony. So they are at the cusp of a new age, something that resonates with the name that they have given to the colony, the New Age colony. It also very much resonates with the mood of the times in a country that has just attained its independence from colonial rule. Significantly, the school inauguration is happening on Jallianwala Bagh Day in 1948, that is 3 days prior to the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. As the scene progresses, we see two middle-aged men who are to be in charge of the school. One is Haraprasad, who hoists the flag and who introduces himself as he will teach Sanskrit and Bengali, and his friend Ishwar, who will teach English and history. In the coming together of these two teachers and their subjects, there is a combination of the old and new, tradition and modernity, of civilizational roots and colonial ruptures. It could be seen as the perfect and ideal representation of Nehruvian national imagination or his development project that attempted to combine many binaries of Gram Swaraj and industrialism, of indigenism and internationalism and so on. In many ways, Subarnarekha is about the destinies of these two streams, these two people, their families. It is about betrayal and separation. The two idealists do not stay together to make their New Age colony a reality or the school a reality. And the project is betrayed from the beginning. First comes the betrayal of Ishwar, who becomes a deserter, according to Haraprasad, and leaves the colony, and so betrays the school project and the collective life of the new life colony. The rational modernist that he is, Ishwar makes his choices rationally and practically and moves on to another place, Chatimpur, to join as an accountant in an iron foundry owned by his friend Ramvilas to earn an income and sustain his family. Though the film follows the life of Ishwar and his little sister Sita and Abhiram, whom Ishwar adopts, who was actually left behind by his mother in the colony when the gundas of the landlords come and abduct her or take her away from that scene, and he seeks refuge and Ishwar gives him refuge in his family, like a brother to Sita. But though the film follows the life of Ishwar and his sister and his young sister Sita and Abhiram, we come to know what happened to his alter ego Haraprasad much later in the film when he appears at Ishwar's house that fatal night when he is about to hang himself. He peers through the window and with a mischievous, ironical smile asks Ishwar, "How far gone is the night?" and answers it himself. No answer comes. These two lines actually also sum up his and their lives till then. As for the idealist activist Haraprasad, his life is a story of frustrations and disappointments, of failed projects and systemic betrayals. As for Ishwar, the Grihastha, the journey only led to the self-made noose hanging from the roof. So, in the case of both of them, the activist and the family man, both of whom started as idealists, one a scholar of tradition, the other a modernist. Actually, he was called Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar during his college days. What life holds for them in the new age that they inaugurated is the same dark destiny of broken promises and systemic betrayals. In the case of Ishwar, the English educated modern rationalist, there was another promise and another betrayal. There is a promise that he makes at the beginning of the film through the act of taking the responsibility for Abhiram, who is a Dalit. Maybe it was a kind of impulsive act triggered by guilt, an act of recompense for his running away or reneging. But what he offers to Abhiram is a new life and family, a family that welcomes the downtrodden into its lap, despite his caste. It is also the promise of the new nation. The imagination of nation is family that is inclusive and caring of all. What happens to that promise? We later see that he reneges on this promise too, though he initially takes care of Abhiram and educates him. When the moment of reckoning comes, when Abhiram's caste is revealed before others, at that instant he backtracks. Nor can he imagine Abhiram, who is in love with Sita, marrying her. He actually wishes Sita would rather die than marry him. One can see the film as to how these three generations of Haraprasad, Ishwar, Abhiram, Sita, and finally Binu, Sita's son, how they nurse their dreams and hopes of a new life and home, and how their dreams are destroyed, stolen, or betrayed. If you look at Ghatak's film from the point of view of broken promises, we can see that it is a leitmotif that runs through his over. Sadly, his life itself was a great promise that went largely and tragically unfulfilled. Many were the film projects he dreamt of and never took off. Many he started and left incomplete. Like in his films, his artistic career too was riddled with many sudden interruptions and intermittent gaps. Two peculiarities or strategies that mark Ghatak narratives, as has been pointed out by many scholars, is the interruptions of different kinds. There are digressions, there are songs, there are shots of landscapes, tableau-like shots and all that. Then there is also another very distinguishing feature about Ghatak films. There are no flashbacks in his films. As for flashbacks, the only one that we will find in his films is the one from Jukita Paur Gappo, where Neelkant is sitting in the public park at night with Bangabala and Nachiket, when he suddenly says, "I too was young once, full of hope, enthusiasm and faith." And the scene cuts to him and his wife in their youthful days in a hilly landscape full of joy and love. But that brief sojourn into the past is abruptly cut by the arrival of the police at the scene. But for this flashback, it is not a device that Ghatak is fond of. He would rather have a character tell the story that represent it all over again, represent the past all over again. It is as if he doesn't want to revisit or revision the past, or the present times that his characters are in do not allow such luxury. As for interruptions and digressions, they constitute the incursions or breaks in continuity or disruptions in the flow of the narrative and its overwhelming logic is one that Ghatak uses as a Brechthian alienation device, a trope that forms an integral and inevitable part of the story itself within the Ghatak narratives. They evoke parallels to the idea of how history itself disrupts its own promises and the civilization betrays its own dreams and in the process shattering the dreams of people. The deep sense of loss and of dreams that are frustrated and unfulfilled, what do they signify? What are the promises that are betrayed? What are the dreams that elude his characters? Obviously, these promises and dreams, frustrations and betrayals trace the post-partition history of the nation, one that haunted Ghatak throughout his life. Maybe you can draw from his own writings. In one instance, in an article Chitrabhikshan, he talks about his vision of society. He quotes, quote, "A system of life, a diverse flow of men, it does not exist anymore. If it had, I could have stood on that. I could have said something. I wouldn't then have viewed everything with such a distorted mind. The future wouldn't have held such fear. The future of the nation, all men," unquote. Obviously, as many scholars have pointed out, in his films, partition is a wound that never heals, that constantly festers and haunts his characters and narratives. For him, it is the event that marks a rupture in time, divides history, and mutilates an ancient civilization. And in his films, the promise takes many forms. It could be the promise of friendship, camaraderie in action, togetherness in society, kinship in family, bondings of love. In most films, the family constitutes the locus of this promise. Family that can also take various shapes and forms and dimensions, like the refugee colony in Subarnarekha, like the drama troupe in Komal Gandhar, the family born out of sheer necessity for survival as in Nagarik, the joint family that falls apart in Meghatha Katara, the rural nuclear family of Barita Kepali, one that Kanchan rediscovers after his escapade to the city of Calcutta, or the one that can accept everyone into its fold, as in Jukki, Tapo, Gappo. Actually, if you look at the representation of families, the way in which family constitutes the center of Ghatak narratives, for instance, a film like Komal Gandhar begins with a title card in which the drama troupe itself is described as family. This is how it goes. I quote, "Young theatre crazy people, they come together from all places. They form a troupe. Their family grows up with tenderness, affection, jealousy and hatred. They don't have a real family of their own. Here is a chapter in their history," unquote. And again, if you look at the way in which the protagonists, the characters of Ghatak occupy the family, I think it's only Kanchan of Veritake, the young hero of the film, who returns to and reaffirms family. All the others are broken or are never formed. But Kanchan, even when he returns, has seen too many broken homes and divided families, so has mentally outgrown it in a way. For instance, in Nagarik, the promise of a home, a better job, a decent life, all are broken or betrayed as the Batchi family finally moves to a smaller, cramped slum. That the violin string that plays the international breaks also resonate with this theme. In Ajandrik, the family consists of Bibal and the Jalapi, Jagaddal, a bond that again is broken at the end. In that unforgettable scene in Komal Gandhar, we see Bhrigu along with Anasuya standing in front of Padma river, and looking pensively at his homeland on the other side, other shore, remembers his father's last words. "I started off my life smoothly. Look how it ends." Also in the same film, the play at the beginning, the character played by Bhrigu, the farmer who is forced to migrate from his homeland, besides the shores of Padma, and had to move to the smoky Calcutta, he shouts, "Is this a heaven? Everywhere is smoke, even the sky is filled with smoke." Like his father in Nagarik, like in Nagarik, the father in Nagarik too actually rules over his life before he dies. He tells his son the same words that the father, Brigu's father, tells in Nagarik, in Komalganda. He tells his son about the early hopes and the promise of his life and the betrayals and setbacks that followed. He dies a very sad man in Nagarik. In the case of Juki Tako Agapo, it begins with the separation of the nuclear family. The first scene itself is the separation of the nuclear family, where Ghatak himself plays the role of Nilkanda, where his wife Durga and son Satya comes to take leave of him and leaving him alone in his room. And the film itself is a long, futile search for the family, a family that can contain multitudes. It is also a film about broken promises and betrayals of various kinds, familial, political, social, and cultural. All the major artists of the post-independence era have, in one way or another, grappled with the very same dreams and promises. In Indian cinema itself, one can see similar themes and concerns about the disenchantment and growing disillusionment with the system, the anger and outrage at decadence, and the corruption that the system is gradually sinking into. But the way in which Ghatak saw and experienced the malaise was different. His diagnosis and prognosis were also different. I think it drew from the radical way in which Ghatak envisioned and enworlded his life, society and culture, the resources he drew from, and the forms that he adopted to address and express these themes were different. A brief comparison between the other two iconic filmmakers of his generation, Satyajit Ray and Mrinal Sen, may provide us with some insights into what makes Ghatak different. Retrospectively, these three filmmakers seem to belong to three different schools of thought on cinema, society, and politics. While Ray was a liberal, sophisticated humanist, Sen was always a champion of the downtrodden and oppressed, whose films were animated by the spirit of rebellious youth movements and political movements of the time. Ghatak, in contrast, stood in between. He was a filmmaker who was difficult to categorize and pigeonhole. The confluences and conflicts between tradition and modernity, the aesthetic responses and strategies that Ghatak experimented with in his narratives, storytelling modes he relied on, the montage and mise-en-scene styles he adopted, all were different. He was not a typical art filmmaker who was overtly concerned about form, nor did his content stick to the set patterns of the period. It was difficult to find explicit European or Hollywood references or influences in this film. The characterization and acting styles were totally different. So were the visual compositions and sound design. For instance, Ray says about Ghatak, he said for him, Hollywood might not have existed at all. So Ghatak's films are neither as universal as Ray or as politically belligerent as Sen's. And unlike the other two, for Ghatak, Bengal was the center of the world, and partition the traumatic event that ruptured his world or life into two. This is how Chidananda Dasgupta, for instance, compares Ray and Ghatak. Chidananda Dasgupta very much is a fond of Ray than Ghatak, but he also acknowledges Ghatak in a very interesting way. He compares both of them like in these words, quote, "Indeed, one can and should see Ray and Ghatak as two contemporary aspects of the Indian mind, one embodying the contemplative inward principle in which the calm without and the fire within make for an intense clarity of vision. The other representing the active principle, going forward into the here and now with all the power of passion and yet aware of the inner order. One is primarily a poet, the other a dramatist. One, to use André Bazan's formulation, turns reality into spectacle. The other makes spectacles look real, seem real. One is a highly disciplined classicist, the other childlike, wayward, romantic, unquote. This is in his essay, Cinema, Marxism and the Mother Goddess. Again, another line of comparison could be between these three filmmakers, could be the way in which all three authors engaged with the idea of India in their films. The idea of India in their respective body of work drew from their own notions about nation, people and civilization that in many ways are entangled with that of borders, identities, traditions and cultures. Compared to the other two, Ghatak posed, explored and explicated these concerns and questions as a quintessential Bengali, with the ideal of Sonar Bangla, the trauma of partition, the rivers and landscapes of undivided Bengal, all were very much integral and essential to his aesthetics and dramatics. In Ray, these questions are posed and expressed differently. If one takes the three trilogies of Ray, the Apu trilogy of the 50s, Pathar Panjali, Abrajido and Abu Sansar, the Calcutta trilogy made in the 70s, Pradidwandi, Simabadda and Janaranya, and the last trilogy in the late 80s, Ghanashatru, Shagaprasada and Agunduk. It is possible to trace the tendencies and ruptures in Ray's social imagination and political vision. The Apu trilogy made a decade after the historic events like freedom struggle, independence, Bengal famine and partition. And the Calcutta trilogy coincides with the Bangladesh war, the turbulent times that were unfolding in Calcutta with the Naxalite movement, the growing resentment regarding rising unemployment, large-scale political corruption, etc. The last trilogy, at the end of his life, was made at another critical juncture in the nation's history, just prior to the announcement of new economic policies that endorse globalization and privatization and the rising tide of communal politics that led to the demolition of Babri Masjid. All these subterranean, feelings you can have you can feel in Ray's last trilogy. These three trilogies of Ray, made almost 2 decades apart, the 50s, 70s and 90s, almost mark the beginning, middle and end of his work. These trilogies, from these three periods in his life and in the history of the nation, reflect his intense and introspective engagements with the idea of India that shift from youthful innocence and hope of post-independence decades through despairing confrontations and compromises with the establishment and mores in the 70s to a deep despair about the degeneration at all levels by the 90s. In his last trilogy, social and political issues are posed at the deepest level as a civilizational or human crisis. According to many scholars, Ray maps the history of modern India from the perspective of an enlightened liberal. Nonsense perceptions and preoccupations are different. One can see in him a restless filmmaker, experimenting with different times, engaging with the times, experimenting with different formats and styles all along his career. His early films, for instance, Akash Kushum and Bhuvan Shom, differed radically from his Calcutta films of the 70s that deal with the turbulent events that shook the city, like Interview, Chorus, Calcutta 71 and Padadik. They were followed by another set of films like Mrigaya, Okauri Kada, Parashuram, etc. that dug into the histories of oppression from different locales and perspectives. The films that came after that were actually excavations into the middle class mindsets and worldviews, like Ek Din Pradidin, Akale Sandhani, Ek Din Achanak and all that. And Mrinal Sen was a filmmaker who relentlessly tried to wrap his art and mind around questions of oppression, unfreedom of class, caste, gender in all its hues and shades. Another interesting line of comparison could be the images and representations of the city of Kolkata that appears in the films of these three filmmakers. It would present three different Kolkatas, as seen, felt and expressed from different viewpoints. That of the refugees, the slum dwellers, the youth protesting on the streets, and that of the imperial city of the colonial masters, the great city of Tagore, the city of middlemen and aspiring middle class, the city of Addas, etc. Another line of comparison could be the figure of the indigenous people or the Adivasis that appear in the films of these three filmmakers. Take, for example, Satyajit Ray's Aranyar Din Raat or Sen's Mrigaya and Ghatak's Ajandakan Tida Shakti Nadirnam and Jukki Tapor Gappo. Whether it be the presence of the modern city or the culture or life of the indigenous people, each filmmaker follow their own preoccupations and worldviews. If the Tagorean Renaissance ideas predominate in Ray, it is the influence of Marxist ideology, Brechtian and Goddardian aesthetics that animate Sen. In Ghatak, themes boil down to the elemental question of belonging or the longing to belong that is posed in the larger context of Indian civilization. Ashish Rajadiksha and Amit Ganga, in their compilation Ghatak Arguments Stories, make a very interesting observation. I quote, "This distinction is important in the cinema. It is objectively demonstrable that the differences between, for example, Satyajit Ray and Ritwik Ghatak may substantially be traced to the choices they made vis-a-vis the Bengal school of art that preceded them. While Ray has repeatedly reaffirmed his allegiance to Nandalal Bose, witnessed the lessons in organicity he learned in how a tree should be drawn, Ghatak was much more closer both to Binod Bihari and his friend Ramkinkar Baij." Unquote. So if Ray imagined a universal, rational, secular, modern human being, for Sen, the narrative centered around the idea of class. His films were more about divisions and conflicts, decay and diffidence between and within classes. In the case of Ghatak, his vision of humanity goes beyond class and secular rationality. It was much more deeply civilizational in nature, one that had deep roots in Bengali soil, drawing from its plural traditions, diverse cultures, and entangled histories. This is how Ghatak puts it. Quote, "There is an epic tradition which dominates the Indian mentality. It has seeped into the Indian subconscious. It is no surprise, therefore, that Indians are attracted to mythologies. I am part of the tradition. I cannot think of myself without the epic tradition. I am all for it. It is in our civilization since time immemorial. In my films, I rely mainly on folk form. The great mother image in its duality exists in every aspect of our being. So it is not the universal humanity or class being that Ghatak was primarily concerned with. He was concerned with people in the most profound and political sense of the term. One that is always in the process of struggle of becoming. One that is always open to the world yet rooted. So in these dark monocultural times we live in, the civilizational angst of Ghatak has become all the more relevant. It is very important to take stock of our cinema history through the Ghatak lens. For his vision was deeply concerned with the immediate and the present, while seeking nourishment from the founts of multiple traditions and looking forward to a world of freedom and creativity. I think the next century will belong to Ghatak, for all the themes that haunted him are coming back to haunt us, that are refugees, exile and homelessness, of the erasure of indigenous worldviews, of the degeneration of politics and the lack of idealism. Like his themes, the resources he garnered to address and express them, and the forms he experimented with, are also becoming more and more relevant in our times, where cultural and political algorithms are steamrolling our lives into monolithic patterns and erasing plurality and multitudes that we are. I end here. Thanks to Fipresci and all the friends of cinema.